Well, welcome to the second panel of the day. This panel is entitled The Need for Actionable Science. It's also known as the Policy Panel. It's one thing for scientists and engineers to go ahead and produce fantastic machines flying either in space or in our atmosphere. It's one thing for them to go ahead and produce the data and maybe even turn it into information, which was one of the big issues that were coming up in the previous panel. But that's not sufficient. To be able to take that data, that information, and make sure that it's relevant, that it addresses the needs that the policymakers actually are grappling with is a very, very difficult problem. Getting it to the hands of the policymakers and getting it in a timely fashion are other aspects of the challenge that really faces us. And that's what we're going to be addressing today in this panel, is what are the policy ramifications? How do we go ahead and define what the critical data is? How do we make sure we get it in the right hands at the right time? Let me introduce myself. First of all, I'm Jim Graf. I'm Deputy Director for Earth Science and Technology up at JPL. And I'm very honored today to have with me two assembly members. Let me go to my far left, if I may, and talk about Cameron Smyth is the assemblyman.
Politically speaking.
I kind of took note when he said that and chuckled inside.
He's from the 38th Assembly District. He was elected in 2006, and he is the Republican Caucus Chair. Prior to this appointment, Assemblyman Smyth was appointed as Vice Chair of the Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee. As Vice Chair, he sought to direct the committee to scientifically sound policies that promote a healthy environment and a strong economy. Additionally, he is an active member of the Select Committee on the Preservation of California's Entertainment Industry. On my immediate left is Anthony Portantino. Anthony is the assemblyman from the 44th District. He was elected to serve the district also in November 2006. He currently serves as the chair of the Assembly's Committee on Higher Education and is a member of the Transportation, of the Government Organization, and Public Safety Standing Committees. He's also a member of the Assembly Select Committees on the Preservation of California's Entertainment Industry, Foster Care, and Community Colleges. So I would like to first thank both of you for taking the time to come and talk to us. I recognize that you're very busy, and we do really appreciate your attendance. What I would like to do is follow the same format as the previous panel and ask each one of you to speak for 5 or 7 minutes, if you'd like, and then we'd like to go into some questions that I have, and then we will take some questions from the audience. So going alphabetically.
Or age. I didn't say which way.
Anthony, would you like
I like
to
to
go
think
first?
athletic prowess. So they used to call me the Panther because I was so agile.
Anthony, would you like to go first?
Thank you. As you can tell, Cameron and I get along quite well, and I think there's just a little editorial comment. There needs to be a little bit more of that bipartisan spirit up in Sacramento and just about everywhere else. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for coming. This is the 44th Assembly District. So welcome to the 44th Assembly District, and this will get him mad at me, but I'm going to say the best district in the state of California. And he'll say that about his district as well. So it's an honor to be here at Caltech and to be coordinating with the Keck Foundation and JPL. It's for a kid from New Jersey whose father was an electrical engineer who used to follow the space race with my older brother. He passed away when I was a kid. It's just a thrill to have this in my district and down the street from my house, basically, as very, very exciting for me personally just to represent this district. So thank you for being here. I know we're supposed to talk about what works and what doesn't work. Does anybody think the system's working? Any hands go up? Who thinks the system's working? All right, now, You do. Are you related to one of us? Because I keep saying there's a reason why we have a 12% approval rating, and if we keep it up, the only people that are going to like us are our moms. And I also go back. Cameron, did you sit on the sanitation district when you were? Mm-hmm. We both sat on the LA County Sanitation District Board when we were local elected officials. And in all of my experience in 15 years of government and going around with state and local agencies, to me the most efficient run government agency I've ever encountered is the Los Angeles County Sanitation District, and it's actually run by engineers. And think about it. They have the lowest sanitation rates in the country. They're 2 decades ahead of everything that happens. They're planning now for what's going to happen 20, 30 years from now. When regulation comes down the road or is going to be planned, they're in Washington helping to draft it, helping to research it, and they're thinking ahead, and they're not thinking about politics. They're not thinking about anything other than solving a problem in the best scientific, most cost-effective way, and consequently it's a very efficient, well-run district. And I think large part of it is because it's apolitical. It focuses on the facts, and it focuses on how to get things done. So if you ever want to go down and study a really efficient operation, that's one to take a look at. State government, we're caught up, as you heard earlier today from Mary Nichols and others, AB 32 implementation, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. 2 bills got passed the other day, and the governor's already threatened to veto both of them. Let me say that again. 2 bills got passed. What was it? It was all a blur. It was at some point in a 30-hour period.
3:30 in the morning.
3:30 in the morning, when good government happens. And they're both probably going to get vetoed. So I think there is a serious need to integrate scientists, science, engineering, sort of principles versus politics into the issue. I mean, when we're talking about the Renewable Portfolio Standard and, obviously trying to make the environment better by, having non-fossil fuels and, environmentally sound engineering policies, but then we get caught up in, well, how do we get it from point A to point B? How do we transmit? Where is it going to be, built and constructed? Are we going to do it in California and out of California? If we're going to do it in California, what other environmental implications do we have to help facilitate the construction of renewable energy? So all of those other facets get caught up into the system. This year, I was able to pass a bill that was sponsored by the Gordon and Betty Moore, or funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, to provide $7 million to the California Council on Science and Technology to implement a Science and Technology Fellows Program. So I don't know have any of you heard of that program? Anybody in this room apply to it? You've heard of it? Yep. So we're going to get Assembly, Senate, and administration fellows who are scientists in their particular fields of study, and the nonprofit is going to pay the stipend. So it's a way for us to get science expertise in the capital, which is and it's going to be 10 PhD fellows per year in the legislature starting in December of 2009. There were 70 applications for these 10 fellowships right out of the gate. So we're hoping that project continues to or hopefully bears fruit. Another recent thing that just happened, and I see a gentleman with a USGS shirt on. I'll tell you an interesting story. They're contemplating building that 4.5-mile tunnel under the city of South Pasadena through I don't know how many fault lines, about many. And USGS is, right across the street, right? They haven't even talked to you yet. So here we are pushing a project and pushing legislation and contemplating a 4.5-mile tunnel, 8 lanes wide, 300 feet below the ground through fault lines, and we're not even talking to the USGS. So let me go back to my first question. Anybody think the system's working? We can do better, and part of it is I think the turnover in legislators. I think people are there, we're there for 6 years. Many of us leave after 2 years to run for another office, another cohort leave after 4 years to run for another office, and there's not a lot of longevity within each house. And I think that makes the system put pressure on people to do things rapidly. It takes the pressure off having long-term solutions and thinking with a 10-year. How do you have a 10-year plan when legislators are only there for 6 years? How do you think, long-term when we're in a constant budget crisis after budget crisis? And so we tend to react to the crisis at the moment, not necessarily planning. And so I think there's definitely a need to integrate science, engineering, and sort of practical long-term thinking into a system that really doesn't value that. And so I'm excited to hear some of the questions and some of the comments from the audience, and just thank you for letting me come. And I really appreciate my good colleague from up the road, Cameron Smyth. We end up doing a lot of these. We did a TV thing together, I think. So I really appreciate his coming over to the district, and look forward to hearing what he has to say as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and certainly echo my thanks for the invitation. And I can somewhat give Mr. Portantino credit for this being a great assembly district, because my parents met teaching at Pasadena High School and grew up out here. So I've got some. It may be the second best, but it's not bad. I've got Magic Mountain. What else? You got Cal. But
And engineers had to build this.
That's a good point. And as Mr. Portantino pointed out too, he and I do spend a lot of time together. Whether it's we actually spend most of our time together in the airport and on the planes, traveling back and forth. We both have younger families, and so we can kind of share in things well beyond whatever our political registration is. Contrary to what people think, we don't spend all of our time just sitting there talking policy, and we actually get to know one another. And as he pointed out, the issue of term limits really can impact that, because who's to say that in 6 years when he and I are gone, that our replacements will have the same kind of relationship that we have built and are able to capitalize on that and do things that are beneficial to our region as well as the state. Because you do have so much of it is trying to develop relationships, and particularly the scenario I'm in as a Republican. I'm heavily in the minority in the state assembly. It's 51-20. Well, I guess 28 now. It was 29 until Wednesday, but now it's 28. And and so as a result, for someone like me to get anything accomplished, I need as much support and build as many relationships as I can from my Democrat colleagues, because obviously I can't just rely on enough votes to get anything done strictly within my own party. And so because of the term limit and the turnover, every 2 years you have, just as you're starting to build those relationships, people, a big chunk of them leave, and you have to start over again, and that is difficult. And now we're not going to be hypocrites here and say, well, now that term limits is now that we're here, we need to get rid of term limits. We're both here as a result, but it definitely, once you're on the inside, you can see that the challenges you have relationship wise. But aside from my committee and serving as the number 2 ranking Republican, I also co-founded the Republican working group called E3, which stands for Energy, the Economy, and the Environment. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I'm here today, because I felt that for too long my party had taken such a hard line approach when it came to environmental policies that we were completely moved out of the debate. Because we weren't offering anything constructive, and it was just no changes. And this is where an instance of, I think, term limits has been beneficial, because as a result of term limits, you have had the cycling out, and there are a lot of new members that kind of grew up around the same time I did, particularly here in LA, where to me the issues of clean air, quality, water delivery, those things, recycling. Those were all things that I grew up with and learned about in school. And I remember not being able to have football practice because of the smog. If you couldn't, that was the gauge. If you could see the mountains, you could have practice that day. If not, they'd have to cancel it. And so, to me, I never found those contradictory with my conservative principles. And so, as a result, because of term limits, we had a lot more members come in who have shared that position. And so we created this E3 working group that our first year, there were only about 8 of us that were a part of it. And then the following year, we ended up having 23 members of our caucus, which was almost who wasn't a part of it. And because they recognize that if you want to be part of the policy, you have to be willing to engage. And you have to be willing to engage with the administration, with the Democrat leadership, so we can forge some good bipartisan legislation. And one of those that I know we'll get into greater detail is the Green Chemistry Initiative that was passed and signed by the governor last year in 2008, which was something that started, that I had real trouble with and couldn't support. But because of our working together in a bipartisan group and with the administration, we're able to craft something that I believe will help answer a lot of the questions we have and use the resources we have here in California. I mean, the intellectual resources that we have here are well beyond any other state, and we should be putting those to use. So we're hoping that we can still continue to capitalize on that. And so, as Anthony mentioned, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, through the questions, when we're passing legislation like the RPS or even AB 32, I mean, when you're passing something at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, when you've been sitting in the same place since 9 o'clock the previous morning, it really, you question the efficacy of that. I sit on I'm the vice chairman of the Utilities and Commerce Committee, and we heard that RPS bill. Last week we heard it for about 4 hours, and then this week we heard it at 11:45 at night to try to find the final amendments to it. And again, that's not the way it should be done, and sometimes that reflects in the work product, and you'll see things having to come back. So that's why I was really proud about the Green Chemistry Initiative, because it wasn't something we did in the dark of night. People just wanting to get home and sleep deprived. We actually took our time, put something together, and I think it's going to be effective. So thank you for inviting me and including me here, and hopefully we'll have a good dialogue, and that we can get some information that we can take back with us when we head back.
If I could follow up. If I could follow up, the Green Chemistry Initiative, I'm really glad Cameron brought that up, because that's the perfect opportunity for science to guide legislation. What was happening in the past is an interest group would go to a legislator and say, ban this, it's bad. And there'd be a bill. And then, the 79 other legislators would get a stack of information this big saying, well, that chemical's bad, and a stack of information this big saying, no, that chemical's not bad. And then we're supposed to vote, usually at 3 o'clock in the morning, on whether to ban a particular product. And so the idea was saying, well, no, let's not go chemical by chemical. And, I'm a filmmaker, and, I'm not a scientist. So the idea was to set up a green chemistry group of scientists to actually determine and wade through all of the scientific data and then come back to the legislature with, here's the list of chemicals that should be banned, and here's the list of chemicals that shouldn't be banned, and sort of depoliticize it and put some thought process to it. And Cameron is right. That was one of the better things. Now, to be frank, we still do have legislators who don't want to wait for the Green Chemistry Initiative to bear fruit, so to speak, and are still running individual isolated bills on different chemicals because, for one reason or another. But that's where it should work. But again, due to the schedule of trying to get things done because you're there for a short time might be part of why different legislators still run individual bills, where we should have much more of a scientific approach to it. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is start with some of the questions that we have now. Both of you have made one point, and that is things are not functioning that well up at Sacramento. So let's fashion this next question. Well, we can.
Present company excluded. Of course.
Yeah.
I was going to say we're the exception.
But the real question that we have posed today is there are going to be critical decisions that have to be made in the future. And what do you believe the process should be to arrive at those critical decisions and the laws that will stem from them? You know, we have to understand what the process is first before we, the scientists, engineers, can actually inject the information that you need.
Right.
So can one of you?
You know, and I think the green chemistry model, I think you'll probably hear us talk about that a lot today. I think that is a very good model to start with. That something that involves DTSC. So the administration is engaged. You have the Senate committees, Senate Environmental Quality Committee, the Assembly ESTM committee. It really enabled to have a repository of the professionals there. I mean, like I said, vice chair when I was first elected was vice chair of the Assembly ESTM committee. Let's be honest, that's not the committee that everyone dreams to be the vice chairman of. That is, be very honest. I mean, that is a committee that sometimes, is reserved for freshman Republican members. And the only science I ever took really was political science. And so I'm sitting here on a committee having to decide whether or not to ban a chemical or not, based on literally about 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes of testimony. And someone, and I remember our committee, we all got along really well, but there was not one scientist on that committee. We had 3 Ivy League lawyers, but we had nobody who was a scientist. And so having to try to make these major decisions in a short period of time in a politically charged atmosphere really is detrimental. And this one anecdote is, we were having a discussion, assembly member to ban a certain chemical, and my biggest concern always is what are the replacements? What are the alternatives? And have those actually been studied? And have they because I always point gasoline was always first you had to the lead came out and then MTBE is put in for the oxygenate, and we've seen the impacts of that. Now ethanol is the replacement there, but there are now some studies coming out about the impacts that ethanol has. And so when you're making these decisions, my question is always about what is the replacement. And I remember the assembly member said, here's sure, yes, absolutely, here are some replacements, we can go with that. Fine. Next week, we have another set of chemical ban bills coming through, and I look, and one sounds familiar, and I look through. Sure enough, that was one that was being offered as an alternative for the bill a week ago, that is now being pushed through to be banned. And so that is kind of the environment that we had. So hopefully this green chemistry model will actually let those of you who know what you're talking about and don't have a political stake in it, are truly just focused on the science, will be able to make that decision freely, unencumbered, and then make the recommendation to the legislature. And hopefully there will be the members will be willing to accept that as science and be willing. But again, it goes back to the term limit issue that by the time this all comes through, those of us who established the Green Chemistry Initiative will be gone. And so we won't be able to say, look, we established this process. Let's follow it. It'll be the future members. They'll say, well, that was the previous legislature. I didn't approve this process. I don't know who these people are, and so I'm going to go with what I think. And so that's where again you hope that that we can use that as a model and continue to build on it.
Another facet to the whole thing is the budget crisis. So anything that costs money isn't going to see the light of day. So let's say you have something that's worthy of study, and so you want to pass a bill to study something. Studies cost money. We even, in the last 2 years, the budget crisis is so bad that they invented a new thing called cost pressure. So let's say I did a bill that said, I'm going to ask Caltech to do a study, and the study would only happen in the event that Caltech was willing to do the study. They would call that a cost pressure. because it would still require a staff person somewhere to write a letter to Caltech or receive the information back. So the enormity of the budget crisis is affecting a lot of good policy. One of my biggest frustrations, I don't know if you read, umbilical cord blood is my signature issue. There was a family in La Cañada that the son was the first California leukemia patient to have a cord blood transplant 15 years ago or 17 years ago when he was a toddler. And it saved his life, and the mother told my wife and I the story about how umbilical cord blood stem cells cure leukemia. And so we said, oh, great, when we have our child, we're going to donate our umbilical cord blood. Well, 7.5 years ago when my second daughter was born, we went to donate our umbilical cord blood and found out there was no public collection of umbilical cord blood. So if you privately bank, if you want to pay $1,500 to have somebody come into the delivery room and harvest your own child's blood and pay $500 a year to store it for your own personal purposes, you can do that. 1% of the population does that. So 99% of California's umbilical cord blood stem cells get discarded as medical waste. And it cures 70 diseases: leukemia, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia. And when you run the cost models of curing somebody versus a lifetime of treatment costs, banking umbilical cord blood will save hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as estimated 13,000 lives a year. But finding the funding to save money is a challenge as well. So I think that's something independent of us, that the sheer size and magnitude of the budget crisis is also affecting policy decisions. And then the other thing is just the legislative schedule. We go into session in January. We have a month later, we have a bill deadline to introduce bills. A month later, we have a deadline to get the bills out of the policy committees. A month later, we have a deadline to get them out of the House of Origin. And there's all of these self-imposed deadlines that don't allow us. Cameron talked about the 15-minute hearing. It's not like we have a hearing. If that bill didn't get out of that hearing, it might have been dead. So the pressure becomes to pass things through the policy committees, where in the olden days, the policy committees would sit down, and if a bill wasn't ripe, or if they would hold it. And again, if you had a legislator who could come back the next session, there was much more thoughtful discussion and deliberations going on. And actually, and another thing Cameron mentioned, which difficult probably for him to say, but when he talked about needing to have relationships as the minority party, you realize that every committee is stacked with a majority of Democrats. So a Republican can only get a bill out of a committee with Democrats, where a Democrat can get a bill out of a committee without Republicans.
And with not all Democrats.
And with not, yeah,
you don't need it. You don't need it.
Right, we can lose 2 Democrats in every committee and still get a bill out. They need at least 2 or 3, sometimes even more, 4 or 5 Democrats to get a bill out of a committee. And again, that's just the nature of the math of the majority. And of course, it would be the same if they were in charge. But it's just...
Well, that's a speculation. I'm happy to give it a try. Let's give that a try.
But that's just sort of the, it does make it harder for a Republican to move legislation. And it inherently becomes bipartisan because it just has to be. And, again, on our side of the aisle, it sometimes may not force us to be as bipartisan as we need to be. But anyway, next question.
Next question. Last panel, I think Berrien discussed the fact that California is really leading the nation in climate change, and one of the beautiful examples is AB 32. And the question really put to you is, what do you perceive to be the biggest obstacles in actual implementing AB 32?
The term beautiful example for AB 32, I think, would be debated by a lot of folks, particularly in the manufacturing sector. That the burden that AB 32 has put, for right or wrong, on the business community, again, especially the manufacturing communities, has been very significant. And we recently held a meeting in Reno, Nevada, with businesses that had left California and had left for in this case Nevada, to find out what exactly was the reason and the cause. And overwhelmingly, the answer was environmental regulations and the enforcement of that, and the burden that it put on these businesses that chose to, okay, I can just relocate in Reno or Clark County out in Vegas and still provide the services and still do the business in California, but I'll take my jobs with me and we'll relocate. I mean, a perfect example that is Toyota. Last year, Toyota decided to relocate their Prius manufacturing plant from California to Mississippi, from the Bay Area to Mississippi. And they did that because it was a better business model for them, and because of, again, the regulations and the pressure they felt. Never minding the fact that 80% of Priuses or Priis or whatever are sold here in California. So they are not. So you figure so just give you an idea. I mean, you think about the business model, that it's still cheaper for them to relocate across the country, manufacturing them there, and then shipping them back to California. And also, you have to consider, what is the carbon footprint of that? That is, that has made a more significant, nationwide carbon footprint. And so, that's my concern with an AB 32 or similar. Like I said, that's why we created this E3 committee. AB 32 went out right before Anthony and I got elected, and I believe because my colleagues, my Republican colleagues at the time, did not choose to engage. It became a little more onerous, I think, on our economy and our business community than it would have been had we been able to engage from day one. And so that's the concern that I have, that we need to have. And I'm proud of the fact that California is a leader, but we still have to consider the economic implications that some of these issues are having. On the state, and taking jobs out of California and relocating them, to other states. I mean, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, who would have ever thought that the aerospace industry, wouldn't be in California? Well, I mean, to a large degree, it's not now. And Mr. Portantino and I are fighting really hard to keep the entertainment industry here in California. I mean, who would have ever thought 10 years ago that the entertainment industry would have been leaving California? They have. And so there's an overall, we have to get back to realizing that we can have a balance between good environmental policy while still supporting our economy. And we have to still try to find that sweet spot that meets those goals but keeps those jobs here in California.
And what I would add to that is what's missing in the discourse is sort of the big picture economic model. I mean, we do several $1 billion in tax incentives in California. Many have been on the books for decades. We're precluded by law to know which companies get them. So we can't evaluate whether they're effective or not. And you take AB 32 implementation, and if you tie it to an economic model where we're cognizant of what the regulation is going to do to business, but then maybe we provide some incentives to offset the additional costs of the regulation, then it's a win-win for everybody. And I think that's the challenge. I don't think anybody would disagree with, we want to have cleaner policies, but we want to do it in a way that makes the economy healthy. And I think that's where I think we miss. I don't think the legislation is responsible for losing the jobs. I don't think the legislation is responsible for, probably a minor disagreement between Cameron and myself, losing certain industries. It's in the implementation, and it's in the global economic strategy of how we do it, that we just pass the bill and we step away from the consequence. Right. We have to be leaders both, and I think it's a role California has to play, is being a leader in setting the policy bar, but then we also have to come through with the implementation of it that doesn't have us lose, but has us retrofit the plants, has us have the the academic infrastructure to create the new technology, engineering, and workforce. So it's all of that practical implementation. As the chair of the Higher Education Committee, I'm more concerned about losing industry and businesses to other states because we don't have an educated workforce. Not so much the regulatory burden, but when I talk to folks from major high-tech corporations and other things, they don't think we're going to have computer programmers. They don't think we're going to have people who can run systems, because when you look at California's education model, if you're 65 and older in California, we're the 4th most educated state in the country. Okay, 65 and older. 25 to 35, we're 40th. And every decade from 65 to 25 has gone down. So we're not keeping pace with creating a workforce for a new economy, and I think that gives me more of a global concern than whether a regulation might be, onerous or not onerous. And I think that's key part. And I go back to the incentives. Let me say that again. When a company comes in to get a tax credit, we don't know the name of that company. We're precluded by state law. So I had a bill this year just to say, if you're going to take public money from the state, we should know who you are, because then we can evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And it's significant in the political dynamic because to pass a tax requires 2/3, right? But to redirect a tax credit is a simple majority. So if we have a tax credit of $500 million for this industry and it's not doing anything, if we want to move it to something else, we can move it around. But how do we know what's effective if we don't know who's getting it? So that's again a little bit of the system interfering with the outcome.
Thank you. Changing direction a little bit, how ready do you feel the state and local governments and agencies are to use space-based remote sensing to in fact help us fashion the arguments and make knowledgeable decisions on our environmental future here?
I'd probably argue that the locals are probably more ready, and a lot of that I think is because again, the size of local governments. Both Mr. Portantino and I served as on city council members, and he in La Cañada, myself in Santa Clarita, and so from that perspective, the bureaucracy of a city with only 5 council members, you can really drive a direction if you feel like this is important for us in our city. To utilize this resource, they can do it pretty quickly. Usually cities are in pretty good shape financially, at least the ones that we represent, so they can make those adjustments, kind of on the fly, if you will. From the state, again, it's you would think that the state would be in a much better position to do that, and in some sense, I think we could be. But again, things get bogged down in the state because of our budget scenarios that are so overwhelming. Utilizing any new technology and the cost of that, and the training, and the creation and the hiring of people within a new department. I think those are obstacles that presently create a challenge. But again, I look at California and look at the resources that we have here. It makes perfect sense to be creative in our thinking, and if we can find ways to utilize it without it becoming part of the state, and using whether it's a contract base or something like that allows the professionals and again the people who know how to do it and can operate without the political pressures or funding pressures to provide that information. I think it's critical. I mean, certainly the fires that we have seen recently have I've been using this type of technology. I think can provide tremendous assistance to our crews and others. So I think it's there, but again, getting getting a ship the size of California to start looking in that direction takes longer than I think in the local level.
Yeah, the state is huge. There's no question about it. And to the extent that the academic institutions, which so much of what we're using began, I think a lot of I hate to say it, but the impetus is going to have to come from the ground up, not from the top down, just given the size of the system, the severe budget cuts, the consolidation that is going on. We all like to think that good ideas are going to find their way into good practice and that it's simple. It's not as simple as that, but we're both optimists, and we've seen things, and we heard this morning the use of some of the GPS guidance when fighting the fires, and you would think that the fire, one of the things that I kept on hearing about why we weren't using the super scoopers is because they wouldn't fit in certain canyons and couldn't do certain things because of the smoke and different things. But you would think that there was a role for, we can have smart bombs, somewhere that can, hit an outhouse. You would think we could hit a flame in a canyon. So I think I've heard that in the discourse since the fire. So I think that's going to provide an impetus for a greater use of some of this science in fighting fires and other natural disasters. So I think the opportunity is there, and I think that the disaster is going to provide an impetus.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience now.
Those were yours?
Those were the easy ones.
Did your wife write those? By the way, I knocked on his door 12 years ago when I was campaigning, and he was nice to me.
I still would be, too. Given the high turnover in the legislature, how do we maintain continuity of scientific advice and input to political process and decision makers?
We didn't get that one in our packet.
Yeah.
And that is a very real, very real challenge. And there has been talk in just a couple of years. Last year there was initiative to try to tweak, the term limit process to still keep them in place, but to change them a little bit that would allow for a little more continuity. And that is always going to be. One of the unintended consequences of term limits is utilizing that. You hope, and what ends up happening, which isn't necessarily good or bad, but the continuity then becomes with the staff, the professional staff, whether it's member staff or committee staff, or within the agencies, or it becomes with the lobbyists. To be perfectly frank, those are the people that have the institutional knowledge now in California. And while that may be good that there is still some institutional knowledge there, but remember, neither one of those groups is accountable to the voters and to the people. They either have their state employees that are covered, or they're lobbyists that have their interest one way or another. So unfortunately, until there is a tweak of term limits, you're going to have trouble with that continuity within the legislature. But every time you talk about tweaking of term limits, like last time, there was all this discussion about how the speaker was flying, all over the world and buying things out of, at Louis Vuitton in Paris, and $2,500 dinners in Rome, and then obviously with
neither of us were at any.
Correct. Yeah. So when my wife heard that, she's thinking, "Why do you have to go to Rome? Just go to go to Rodeo Drive then, if you can do that." Why and then obviously the the horrific events that took place last week that have really are isolated, but really sully the institution as a whole. Of course you're going to have term limits, and people would want them to be shorter if they could. And so that's the scenario we have. And so I would, my advice is obviously trying to just develop those relationships with the professional staffs that are within the administration or within the Senate or Assembly itself.
Yeah, and I think that the staff issue cuts two ways, because we turn over and our offices turn over. The staff members who staff the legislators turn over quickly, and a lot of the senior staff will go on to become lobbyists or consultants, and so the personal legislative staff has tremendous turnover and loses a lot of experience. At the same time, the committee staff stay for decades. And so you have a situation where the committee staff people in policy areas amass enormous power with legislative staff which, are great but haven't been there as long and don't know, so to speak, which battles need to be fought. So the committee staff take on more of a role, and then you come in. I was blessed. I was a committee chair as a freshman, and changing committee staff requires the approval of the speaker or in the assembly or the pro tem in the Senate. So you as a committee chair can't come in and change your staff, even though you're the chair of a committee, without permission from somebody else. I was lucky in my case in that the committee consultant for my committee had angered everybody. And so there was a whole army of people who wanted to see this particular person, so I had the opportunity to change staff. But most committee consultants are there for decades and have amazing power. And Cameron talked about, I think, the most fundamental construct in this whole thing is, if the public trusts us and believes in what we're going to do, they're willing to fund it, they're willing to do it. And I think we as a body have to earn the public's trust, and it makes it much more difficult when the public reads about perks and trips and other things. And I always use the example, my freshman year I went to a policy summit in Hawaii, and I paid for it myself, but the LA Times still included me in the story of members who used their campaign funds to pay for the trip. And it's like, you can't even win when I used my frequent flyer miles and I paid for the hotel, but I still was, they were so out to get us. And I think part of that is because we've created a situation that encourages that, and we just have to, again, you're never going to read a story about Cameron or myself of these issues, and most members, you're never going to read a story about these issues. I mean, most people are there for laudable purposes and doing good things, but every once in a while, something happens that becomes sensational, and it paints us all and it paints the institution. So, we have to work harder to make sure that we put the good side forward, and obviously having successful policy and getting things done is the best way, but also articulating. I mean, we forget sometimes that when we're going to do something, it's important to articulate the why of why we're doing things and why it makes sense and what's in it for you and what's in it, for you of why it's in your best interest to rally behind something. And so we have to do that all in concert.
Let me follow up with that question on a related one, which is all of us in the science community here, how can we best form sustainable linkages to the existing infrastructure up there? How can we make the dialogue happen so we can get the information up there for you to consider it?
I think it all again starts with just if you want to engage, you're able to do that by creating whether it's I don't want to say a nonprofit, but or a think tank group or something like that becomes and that has a known presence and an active presence. I mean, it can. A good example of a couple of years ago there was it's kind of a tangent, but a couple of years ago there was a very self-described sexual predator that was in our communities. And was preying on kids, and it was what he was doing was not against the law. He was exploiting a loophole. However, it really fired up a lot of parents, and actually, my wife and a woman from the 44th joined together. Didn't know each other at all, but because her son was actually described in one of this pedophile's web blogs. And then he was now praying or going to places where my wife takes our kids. They banded together and created a group called Mothers Against Sexual Predators, and have made it their focus to be engaged. And they track legislation, and they testify at committee hearings. They send out notices to their group to contact their legislators, and so now it's gotten to the point where the legislators are seeking them out, and they have that credibility within the building. So one of the bills that was just passed, my colleague came up and asked me, "Hey, we need to get your wife's group to send a letter to the governor's office to make sure they sign it." So, I mean, if a couple of moms, from Eagle Rock and Santa Clarita can get together and influence policy and be a part of it, certainly that can be done. And I mean, with the juice that you guys have and the credibility you have, I mean, getting involved, I think would be tremendous, and you would have a tremendous credibility in the building.
Well, I think there's a great opportunity for the academic and science world to get involved. I mean, JPL 2 years ago asked me to invite legislators and staff to do a tour of the facility. We had over 100 legislators. I think it was the most legislators at one time that had ever been at JPL, and we had, I think, 100 people came from all over the state to tour the facility just to see what was there, and that was done by an open invitation to get people involved. Another major university, I won't mention which one because I don't want to create any rivalries, came to Sacramento a year and a half ago, brought all of their deans and had invited about 10, I think they invited more than 10, but a whole bunch of legislators to come in and have a roundtable discussion with all of the deans from this institution. And they said, if you have something you want us to research, call on us. And that's how I got the cost-benefit analysis on the cord blood statistics, because I called the school back and said, well, I've got a job for you. And they found a grad student who did the cost-benefit analysis on umbilical cord blood. So that was a university taking the proactive approach of coming to Sacramento and offering their services. We hear from the universities in lobbying efforts usually against legislation that affects them. I just carried a bill to authorize all the private institutions, the private post-secondary schools, and Caltech was part of an organization that was lobbying to be exempt from state regulation, and you were heavily involved in that. But being more involved in offering opportunities to support legislation in an academic pursuit, or as this other university did, I think there would be a welcomed atmosphere up there, because many of us are looking for impartial information. We're looking, especially on controversial topics, to go into a hearing and say, and have a Caltech professor or a NASA JPL scientist testifying who has looked through something helps us. So a lot of folks don't realize that we can take advantage of your expertise unless you offer it. And I just used the model that this was one, and I was surprised. They just showed up and invited us all, and all the deans were there. And I'm not shy. If you ask me if I have a job for you, I'm always looking for free labor. And so it's a give and take. And so kickstarting it is not a bad thing.
Very good, thank you. Next question is, what do you see as the primary challenges to decarbonization of California's energy system?
I think obviously cost, is, and I don't mean to just say cost, but I think that is one. I think too the other issue, and is one that has been of significant frustration to me, is kind of the lack of communication, I guess, and the way, and what I mean by that is, in Sacramento we pass all of this legislation that will say, we've got to meet these standards, and we need to utilize our renewables and that's great, and a lot of those I support, and I think it's the route to go. The problem is getting those RPS, getting that to the grid. In terms of transmission, is the key component now, and because what's happening is any utility company that is now trying to build new transmission lines or upgrade existing corridors are being met with major litigation and opposition at the local level. So you have, and I'm not saying this. I'm just throwing it out there. So you'll have one environmental organization say it's the Sierra Club. I'm not meaning it's the Sierra Club. I'm just saying it.
Sierra Club, if you're out there, Cameron Smyth just invoked your name.
I can't get much more than like a 2% rating they give me already. So I guess it doesn't really matter. Which really angers me but that's another thing.
Tell us what you really feel.
Point is though, if we'll have these committee hearings and say the Sierra Club, California is there advocating for that, and then so that's great. But then when Edison or PG&E or Sempra starts trying to upgrade their existing corridors or building new ones, Sierra Club LA or San Diego litigate to stop because it can't go through here. It creates this dynamic here, this problem there. And so it's all about the follow through that Anthony mentioned earlier. We pass this stuff and then kind of wipe our hands of it and say, well, I'm sorry, utilities, that's up to you now. And it shouldn't be that way. That if we're going to pass and put these mandates on businesses, then we should make sure that they can get that that technology to the grid. I mean, we have so much here in California. I mean, the best solar in the world is here in Death Valley. We've got tremendous wind, geothermal, the hydro technology, and now wave technology is starting to come online, which I think is really exciting. But we have to be able to get that technology to the grid so we can get that decarbonization. And until we're able to support those companies that want to do it, whether it's a private or a utility, we're going to have these challenges of getting it to getting to the customer and getting it online.
Okay. I couldn't agree more.
Can you say that in the microphone, please?
No, I wouldn't. Did I say that? No, I think the biggest challenge is there's a need for an adult in the room. There's a need for. It was funny. If that camera wasn't here, I would be even more frank. I had that conversation before this was started. I said, "You realize you're going to cut half of my stuff out by putting that over there." But there's a common goal, but there's nobody in charge to say we need to work this out. The two renewable portfolio standard bills that got passed at 3:30 in the morning, the governor's already come out and said he's going to veto them. Okay, they've been worked on for a year and a half. They're going to get vetoed. You would think it would have made more sense to engage in the process, to have come out and said, all right, this is the framework that we need to work towards. These are the four problems we need to have a solution to, and work backwards from the goal and have it crafted to the point where all of this work is going to end up in a bill that's going to be signed. You would think that would be the approach, but it's almost like all of the legislative work happened in a vacuum, gets passed, and now it's going to get vetoed. The chief executive, the somebody, there's got to be, because a lot of times some of the competing interests are also on the same team, but there just needs to be a referee. There needs to be something, some framework for success, and it just doesn't. That's why I go back to the sanitation district analogy in the beginning. It's problem, solution. How do we get from point A to point B in the best way? And if you have the overriding environmental principles, at the end of the day, we're going to have clean energy and less fossil fuels, and we know what the goal is. It's the referee to get us there. That's what's missing.
Anthony, if I take your analogy about the sanitation department, then I think you found your answer with all the scientists and the engineers in the room here.
Oh, that was the other thing. Well, who's going to run for office? You were asking.
Wait, what? What do you mean?
Well, they were
no
asking.
No one's here. Who lives in Santa Clarita? Let's make sure. We're going to.
No, but seriously, I mean, we talk about how do you engage in the process. I mean, you made the point when you were talking about sitting on Environmental and Toxic Committee was a bunch of lawyers. Why aren't scientists running for office?
Because they're too smart.
That's it. See that? That's probably why.
Okay, one last question, and that this is the real one that you wrestle with all the time, and that is, how do you deal with the tension between the near-term need for economic growth, the jobs, the stimulation, solid businesses, versus the environmental protection, which always seem to be at odds with one another?
Well, and I think that's where, back to my opening comments about the E3 committee, because obviously a lot of the odds came from within the Republican caucus, and by creating this committee, it was amazing when I co-founded it with our now minority leader, who actually is a scientist. Is the only PhD scientist in
geophysicist, I believe.
Yeah, he seismologist. It's amazing, But so he saw the need. He's from San Luis Obispo, and so he and I put this together, and it was, like I said, when we started to engage the business community, you couldn't imagine the sigh of relief from them and their willingness to finally, yes, thank you, because so many businesses want to comply and want to stay here in California, and they do genuinely care about the environment and want to utilize the latest technology. But what was happening is that so much of in their mind, was so much of the legislation was just going too far, too quickly, that they couldn't comply. And so the business community, I think, very much wants to engage and has where they can. And so we can, like when you had the Green Chemistry Initiative, you had the oil companies in support, and right after them, the Sierra Club testified both in support of this. And so when you see something like that, I mean, how can't it get 78, 80 votes in the assembly when you have both sides agreeing that it's a good work product and it's good for both their industries? So that's where we try to find that that sweet spot. And I think the RPS bills that were vetoed or that are threatened to be vetoed, I think the concern is that we already have our 20% goal in place, but we're not even close to meeting that. And so what this RPS bill did was drive it up to 33%. And I think that there is concern. Myself, I opposed them because I felt that by jumping up that quickly, we need to let ourselves start to see how we can meet that 20% goal, so we have a pathway before we exercise it. And I think the ultimate concern is, do we want to just do things here in California, which are important, but if it's just driving businesses to other states or to China, to India, where they have really no environmental regulations, it still creates a greater global impact that I think, again, we talked about with the space-based technologies, that you can see how those impacts apply. So I think I think businesses are starting to engage, but clearly what's happened because of the budget crisis, you're seeing that the environmental stuff is getting pushed back a little bit. You see it at the national level, and you're seeing it here in California because the immediate need, that, as the question pointed out, is so great right now that it's hard to keep other issues in place. But you have to you can't forget about them. You have to find that sweet spot that we're hoping to find.
And I'd change the dynamic a little bit in that. We definitely react to the crisis at the moment. I mean, that's sort of, a big part of what happens. But I think the interest groups sort of take a bunker mentality about change. They fight it, and then when it's inevitable, then they join into the how do we make it work prospectively. And again, part of that is the lack of the adult in the room who says, all right, let's figure this out before we go forward. But part of it is the entrenched nature of the interest groups, that people fight change until it's inevitable. And I think we have to have a system. We have to deal with articulating why it's in the best interest. I personally think it's in the long-term best interests of the business community to have a system that works, that's environmentally friendly. I think that new technology and new opportunities are going to present more economic opportunity for California. Again, we not only have all of the great energy opportunities, but we have the science basis to take use of it. So I think we get off on the wrong foot because of the bunker mentality, and then we're playing catch up on the follow through aspect later. And I just think for a host of things that came up today, you sort of get a glimpse of why that's part of the deal. And hopefully, some of these issues will be the national discourse will help. But I just think there's a role for California to be certainly on the forefront. And, you can see that legislators can sit down and talk and try to figure things out. I'll just have to become governor, and you can become lieutenant governor, okay?
Of course. Isn't that the way? I'm the vice chairman. I'm the lieutenant governor. Just one last follow-up, and where I think where you can help that I'd forgotten to mention is that is enabling to have that global perspective. Because so much is done in a vacuum, and I'm working on legislation that would, in effect, say that if you're going to impose certain regulations, what are the ancillary effects? An example was in San Francisco, they recently passed banning plastic bags, and that's fine. That's the deal they made. But what they didn't anticipate or look into is that when you talk to the bag delivery guy, it used to just take him one truck to deliver all his plastic bags throughout the city. Well, now there are no plastic bags. It takes him 7 trucks to make the same delivery because of the size of the bags and the weight and all. And so while you've helped with the bag issue, but you've now put 7 more transportation trucks onto the streets, versus 1. And so the other issue that we're talking about is what's called once-through cooling. That again brings to help cool power plants. The water's sucked in, and to try to cool it. It's a pretty antiquated way to deal with things, and you have a lot of impact on natural resources, fish, and others who get caught in the vacuum. So there's discussion to ban the once-through cooling. Okay, but what does that mean for those power plants? Do they have to shut down, or do they construct? What are the costs of that? So before we just act in that vacuum, and that's where I think the panel we have here and those of you that are here in this conference can really help us understand that if you ban the bag, well, you're going to put 7 more trucks on the streets. If you're going to ban the once-through cooling, power plants are going to have to shut down. What are the impacts of that? What's the cost of refiring them up, upgrading? And so it's coming from an independent voice, not just the owner of the power plant. So that's what I would leave you with. Is that that's a perfect example of where you can provide information to us. So we're not just making these narrow, focused decisions that have big impacts outside of that you may not know.
Anthony, any other point?
I just want to see again how many of you are going to run for office. One hand. There you go. All right. Thank you.
All right. Let me thank both assemblymen for coming down and giving us their time. Thank you very much.
If I could, we've also been joined, sitting over there in the back, is the Chief of Staff for Senator, Donnie's turned it around. Chief of Staff for Senator Gloria Negrete-McLeod is in the office, so Donnie Wilcox came down from Sacramento, and I see Carol Lou's District Director, Tara Garaya, and my District Director, Julian Hines, who's also here, and your guy. Introduce your guy.
Ed Masterson, my fielder. No, Ed's there as well. Those are the guys that get all that have that do all the real tough work while we're in the Capitol. So we couldn't do it without them.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.